Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jordan Newton, a research associate at the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I would like to welcome you to the webinar today, where we will be discussing our recently released report on the teacher workforce in Michigan. Our report examines the statewide trends in teacher demand factors and supply factors. It also looks at broad indicators of teacher shortages and what strategies might be employed to address labor market imbalances. Our research on this important topic and the subsequent report we released last week were made possible through the financial support provided by the Thiel Case Foundation. We would like to thank the foundation for its support of our research program over the years. Our report, along with a shorter summary, can be found on our webpage at www.crcmich.org. Before getting to the webinar material, let me give you a brief introduction to our organization. The Citizens Research Council of Michigan is a statewide nonpartisan public affairs research group. We are celebrating our 103rd birthday this year, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of informed public policy for state and local governments through the provision of accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit entity. As such, we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, and corporations. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. You can learn more about the Research Council at www.crcmich.org. At the right of our website, you'll find an opportunity to sign up for our email distribution list to be notified about newly released papers. Craig Thiel is our presenter today. Craig serves as the research director and joined CRC in 2006 after working in state government for 10 years. Craig's primary areas of focus include state finances, education, transportation, and intergovernmental relations. Craig received degrees from Kalamazoo College and Wayne State. Please note, we are recording this webinar and we will post it up on our webpage where it will be available for future viewing. Second, we have everyone but the presenters on mute, so we will not be able to hear you if you speak. To ask questions, please type the question into the questions pane that should be appearing on your screen. You can type these questions in at any time. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please let us know by calling 517-485-9444. After the webinar, you will receive an email soliciting your feedback, and we would very much appreciate any feedback you have. With that, I'll turn things over to Craig.
Good afternoon. Just to give you a heads up on what we're going to cover over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to look at a snapshot of the current teacher workforce in Michigan, both what's happened in terms of its size, but also some compositional changes. We're going to look at statewide trends in teacher demand, the factors driving the annual demand for teachers in our public schools. We're going to look at teacher supply at the front end of the teacher pipeline and throughout the pipeline. Where is Michigan getting its public school teachers from? And then finally, we'll look at what occurs between the demand and supply for workforce and what we can say about teacher shortages. And finally, I'll wrap up with a couple mentions of some policy considerations for state and local stakeholders as they approach teacher shortage issue. There's been a steady drumbeat surrounding teacher shortages across Michigan. Public schools in Detroit have been at the epicenter of the shortage debate. The main district there has been dealing with the problem of classroom vacancies for many years. While some progress has been made in finding teachers, the district continues to be challenged. Reports from this past fall revealed that the district was still short some 90 teachers. Progress made on over a 200+ teacher vacancy the previous year. And Detroit is not alone. Media reports from this past fall covered the situation in both small and large districts, rural and urban, east and west, and all the way up north in the UP. Our motivation behind the research was to move beyond the media accounts and anecdotal evidence to see what we can say from a data-driven perspective. If there are shortages, where are they, and what are the broad parameters associated with them? Our hope was to do a deep dive into the most relevant available data, examining shortages at the district and regional level. We hope that by shedding light on issues surrounding the state's teacher labor market, this research will help orient policy discussions at the state and local level around how to address this vexing topic. Unfortunately, the data that we wanted and hoped for wasn't available to do the deep dive. It was limited. The state does not collect and report the key elements like district-level teacher vacancies, salaries for beginning teachers, job openings, where and how long those openings remain, or hiring information. Where was a teacher trained? In what classroom did they ultimately get assigned to? This is just a sampling of some of the information and data required to do the deep dive we had envisioned. However, we were able to look at state and federal data sources collected by the Department of Education, the Center for Educational Performance and Information, the U.S. Department of Ed, as well as some district-specific data to inform our research. Overall, our frame of reference for the research and the resultant report is largely examining broad statewide trends and patterns related to teacher supply and demand, as well as the information that is compiled and reported specific to teacher shortage. Let's begin with the global picture of the teacher workforce. It should be of little surprise that the general trend has been one of decline. As the state's student population has shrunk, so has the public school labor force. Teachers represent a little under 1/3 of the total labor force, the second largest group in public schools, behind the non-instructional staff grouping, which represents just over 1/3. In 2006-17, there was just under 99,000 teachers assigned to traditional public and charter schools. This is down 16% from 10 years prior. While smaller, Michigan's current K-12 teaching workforce looks very similar to what it did 10 years ago, almost entirely white and majority female. Beyond the physical appearance of the typical classroom teacher, other attributes of the workforce have changed very little over time, including the average age, classroom experience, and educational background. One noticeable change has been the shrinking racial and ethnic diversity of the teaching workforce compared to the state's overall population and its civilian workforce. In 2015, roughly 82% of the state's population and 84% of the overall workforce identified as white non-Hispanic, well below the 92% of the teaching workforce that is white non-Hispanic teachers. Over the past 10 years, the racial and ethnic composition of students attending Michigan K-12 schools has become more diverse, while the racial ethnic composition of the teaching force has become less so. The non-white student population rose from about 30% of total enrollment in 2008 to over 33% in 2017. As the student populations become more diverse, the percentage of non-white teachers shrank from 10% of the workforce to just under 9%. I should also note here that the lack of diversity in the teaching workforce is largely the result of changes in the composition at various phases, racial composition at various phases in the pipeline. Further upstream in the pipeline, data suggests that the cohort of future teachers becomes less diverse at every phase. From the early phase of enrollment in teacher prep programs through to teacher certification and placement, the gap between white and non-white participants grows. Schools and districts face a smaller pool of non-white future educators, largely because of leaks earlier in the supply chain. Just as Michigan's population is aging, with seniors and older workers representing the largest and fastest growing segments, its teacher force is also getting older. The graying of the profession is a demographic trend commonly cited as a contributor to shortages. Middle-aged teachers represent a significant aspect of the current workforce. Today, nearly 1/3 of the teaching force is in their 40s. Given that the average school employee retires at age 60, it is likely that even the oldest educators within this middle-age grouping are still years away from meeting minimum age and service requirements for retirement. Collectively, they represent a large growing portion of the current workforce that will need to be replaced as they exit the classroom in future years. This graph shows a 10-year history of the labor force and student enrollment. As one would expect, the overall labor force's decline was shrinking enrollment, a trend that predates the chart by a couple of years. A couple of highlights in the chart. First, the largest single-year decline occurred between 2006 and 2007, a 5% drop. This might be explained partially by a delay in staffing levels that occurred in reaction to change in student enrollment trend picture. Again, student enrollments started declining a few years earlier in 2004, and this may have been a delay in districts recognizing the reduction in their force that was needed. Initially, schools probably responded cautiously to the decline in enrollment before realizing the long-term nature of the enrollment reduction. Second observation is the period with the most sustained decline occurred between 2009 and 2012. Labor force decreased 9% over this period. This is likely in reaction to the economic disruptions and funding challenges districts faced coming out of the Great Recession, or as a result of the Great Recession. One result of the disparate rates of change between enrollment and teachers is the student-teacher ratio. Since 2008-2009, Michigan's ratio has been slowly increasing with the slowdown in teacher hiring. A public push to return student-teacher ratios to pre-recession levels would increase the demand to hire additional teachers. It's estimated that based on the statewide student enrollment in 2016, then an additional 3,500 teachers statewide would be needed to reduce the ratio to Michigan's pre-recession level. Teacher shortage represents much more than just a headache for district hiring officials. The time, effort, and resources spent posting, hiring, and onboarding staff can be significant, and with limited resources, these costs come at the expense of other school spending priorities. Estimates associated with these costs vary depending on a host of factors, but they're definitely measured in the thousands of dollars, and some estimates for filling hard-to-staff urban districts can approach $20,000 per vacancy. In Michigan, shortages are a particularly important issue given the state's struggles with student achievement. As many of you know, Michigan's achievement ranking has been falling for years and now ranks in the bottom third of all states on many of the key metrics tracked on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the nation's report card. It's not just one group of students that is struggling in the classroom. All of our students are not getting the education they deserve. Students of color, white students, low-income students, and even high-income students are falling behind relative to their peers in other states. All student groups have seen their ranking on this slip over the past 10 years, and many of these groupings weren't top performing before the slippage occurred. What happens when districts face shortages? They have a few tools to rely on, but generally they respond by canceling academic offerings. These might be non-core classes like art, music, phys ed, in order to assign teachers they do have to core subject classrooms. Students are added to existing classrooms, thereby increasing class sizes for teachers and raising student-teacher ratios. Schools also respond by employing more long-term substitutes or hiring underprepared teachers, which has a disproportionate impact on students of color and low-income students. Study shows that shortages stymie the kind of continuity required to build and establish relationships among teachers, students, and families. These strong relationships allow schools to establish norms for instructional quality, professional conduct, student behavior, and parental involvement, all which are linked to student achievement. The bottom line, shortages can be real and costly, impediments to student success in the classroom as well as later in life in terms of economic well-being. Ignoring shortages when they exist runs the real risk of jeopardizing the most productive ingredient in a child's education, the teacher. In many discussions of teacher shortages, the issue is often framed in terms of an insufficient production of new teachers. That is, the number of teachers completing their formal training through an educator preparation program and then going on and gaining state certification. While this is an important element, teacher production is just one of a myriad of factors affecting the labor market at any given time. Economists who study the labor market look at all factors involved, generally differentiating between those affecting the supply of teachers, such as the production of new teachers, as well as the demand for teachers, such as changes in student enrollment. Framing the discussion in terms of supply and demand broadens the discussion of shortage beyond just supply-side factors. A conceptual model for determining whether an imbalance between supply and demand exists is presented here. In theory, teacher demand is defined as the number of teachers required to adequately staff schools based on student enrollments and student-teacher ratios. Estimating demand requires examining the number of teachers retained from the previous year and projecting the number of teachers required to meet student enrollment projections. The number of additional teachers required in any given year because of attrition or increased enrollment is based on desired student-teacher ratios, largely a qualitative measure set by local officials. Similarly, the concept behind teacher supply is straightforward. The supply of teachers is represented by the pool of employed teachers, newly trained teachers from teacher prep programs located within the state, teachers pursuing training through alternative routes, teachers trained out of state but looking to relocate to Michigan, and experienced teachers who've left the profession and are returning. All of these factors are important, salient to the discussion of supply. With that high-level orientation of supply and demand, let's turn to the demand side first and examine some statewide trends. We can think of demand for teachers in two ways. First, total demand represents the total number of educators needed any given year to educate the state's total school population. This includes those teachers that remain in the classroom from year to year, plus all new qualified teachers required of schools. Total demand is helpful to understand the overall size and makeup of the workforce for a given period, but it's not nearly as relevant for discussions on school staffing needs and teacher shortages. Instead, I want to focus on the demand for new teachers. That is because the vast majority of teachers remain in the profession from one year to the next and in the same school or school district from one year to the next. There are a number of components at work here, including changes in student enrollment, student-teacher ratios, and the number of teachers changing schools, broadly referred to as turnover. As this chart demonstrates, the lion's share of demand is driven by teacher attrition. This is represented by the two large slices, the pre-retirement attrition and retirement attrition. I borrowed this chart from the Learning Policy Institute report based on 2016 data. It shows that 96% of demand was driven by these two pieces, with pre-retirement exits accounting for 2/3 and retirement 1/3. The key takeaway is that while retirements play a role in demand, they're not the driving force behind attrition. One examination of recent trends put it more bluntly by suggesting that the, quote, dire warnings of shortages resulting from an aging teacher workforce looking to retire may no longer be true. In addition to a smaller role played overall, retirement exits can be much more predictable when considering staffing needs, whereas pre-retirement exits are less so. Given this, it's important to look at what teachers are leaving the profession and why. Concerns about high turnover, especially for new teachers, generates considerable debate in education circles. One oft-cited statistic about the profession is that about 1/2 of all new teachers leave within the first 5 years of entering the profession. This 50% in 5-year statistic has become ubiquitous with the shortage debate. However, the statistic is dated and subsequent research has shown it to be unreliable. More recent estimates show that about 83% of new teachers were still teaching after 5 years, suggesting an attrition rate of 17% overall. Still, research shows that newer teachers leave at higher rates than experienced teachers. Further, attrition rates in hard-to-staff schools are often in the 30% range and sometimes can even reach 50%. Research has documented that others leaving at higher rates include math and science teachers. Many of these individuals exist because of the lack of adequate classroom preparation and for better paying jobs. Special education and early and English language learner teachers also leave at higher rates. We also know that teachers in high poverty and high minority schools have high attrition rates. These are the schools with the most challenging working conditions, including students with the greatest academic needs. Also, these are the schools facing the greatest degree of accountability scrutiny for low academic performance. The heightened attention to standardized testing accountability measures and sanctions related to those measures in these schools drive teachers out of the classroom at higher rates. Attrition rates in hard-to-staff schools can be as high as 30% over the first 5 years of a teacher's career, and again, reach the 50% point. Teachers of color have higher attrition rates largely because they are concentrated in those schools with more teacher exits. This is mostly a function of the school environment, as research has shown that white and black teachers exit the workforce at approximately the same rate when school conditions are held constant. It is just the case that teachers of color are more likely to work in these high turnover schools. A recent Michigan Department of Education analysis brings some light to this. In 2017, I should say, attrition among white non-Hispanic teachers in Michigan classrooms was about 8%, compared to 9% for Hispanic teachers and nearly 12% for black teachers. These were one-year attrition rates across all of Michigan public schools. Rates varied depending on location and school type. Finally, research documents that a teacher's pathway into the profession also influences their likelihood of exit. Those entering through alternative pathways are more likely to leave than those teachers prepared at traditional programs. This should not be surprising given the fact that studies have shown that teachers with the least preparation are 2 to 3 times more likely to leave than those with comprehensive training, including opportunities to student teach. Generally, those entering through alternative routes receive less pre-service training. Similar to other professions, teachers leave for any number of reasons, including retirements, district staffing decisions, personnel reasons, professional reasons. Research done by the Learning Policy Institute suggests that the most frequently cited reasons were dissatisfactions, specifically with the frequency of the student testing and heightened accountability expectations, lack of administrative support, and working conditions. Further down the list, financial considerations were listed as a determining factor in their decision to leave. Similar to other occupations that experience employee turnover, departing teachers may be broken into 2 camps. Movers are those who move to teaching positions in other schools, and leavers are those who exit the profession altogether. Generally, year over year, school departures are fairly evenly split between the 2 groups. This slide presents 2 charts based on U.S. Department of Ed and Michigan Department of Ed data examining teacher turnover over time. Each bar in each chart represents the entire teacher workforce in the base year. The analysis behind the data looks at year-over-year changes in teacher employment from this base year. A teacher either stayed employed in the school, moved to another school, or left the profession altogether. The data is presented for 2005, 2009, and 2013. For Michigan, we add an extra year of data. Comparing Michigan's experience with the overall U.S. rates provides some perspective about what's going on with Michigan relative to the nation. But I should note, it tells us nothing about acceptable levels of turnover or adequate staffing levels in our public schools. Examining the 2 charts shows a difference of just over 4 percentage points. Michigan's rate is nearly 25% higher than the national figure in 2013. Had Michigan been at the U.S. average, schools would have had to fill about 3,800 fewer teaching positions in 2013. Michigan's most recent experience in 2017 shows that turnover rate, although down a bit, has remained fairly constant at about 19%. The second observation is that in addition to the relative instability in the workforce compared to the U.S. overall, the state's turnover picture is worsening. This is clear from looking at Michigan's experience over this 12-year time frame. The combination of movers and leavers increased from 17.5% in 2005 to 19.3% in 2017. Had Michigan's 2017 rate remained at the 2013 level, schools in the state would have had to fill 1,600 fewer teaching positions that year. This chart dissects a little in a little more detail the previous chart for Michigan. Here we're looking at data by school locale for the most recent 3-year period, disaggregating the statewide numbers from the previous chart. As a group, urban schools have the highest turnover rate, nearly 24%, and well above the national average of 18%. These are the districts you might commonly think of as urban: Detroit, Flint, Lansing, Kalamazoo, just to name a few. Suburban, rural, and town districts are very similar in terms of turnover rates, hovering around 16% and below the net statewide average. Reflecting back on the previous chart, we see that outside of Michigan's urban districts, the rest of the state's schools have turnover rates much more in line with the national average. As we think back a couple slides ago to the discussion about teachers who are exiting the profession at higher rates, this chart should not come as much of a surprise. As we know, many of the schools in these districts, the urban districts, are some of the most challenged academically, presenting difficult working conditions for teachers. The student population in urban districts tends to be lower income and majority minority. These schools and student body characteristics are closely associated with higher teacher attrition. So this has some serious implications for equity in our state. High turnover in some of the most challenged schools means that there may not be an adequate supply of teachers to teach the most vulnerable groups of students. With a constant churn in the labor force in these schools, classrooms are being led by freshly minted teachers, those least prepared for challenges of the job. As a result, student achievement suffers with inexperienced and ill-prepared teachers. Regional patterns also show up in the teacher turnover rates. Differences are seen across the state's 10 prosperity regions, with schools in Metro Detroit and Southwest regions exhibiting the highest average turnover rates at 20% and 18% respectively. The West Michigan prosperity region shows the greatest stability in its teaching workforce with a turnover rate of 15%. The fact that Detroit area shows up here is not surprising again, when you think about the school settings with the highest turnover rates discussed previously. The Detroit metro region is the home to the highest concentration of urban districts. These are the ones that had turnover rates of 24%. Variation also exists across school governance models. For the 2017 year, teacher turnover was much higher in charter schools statewide at about 30% than in traditional public schools. Michigan's experience here is consistent with other states. The pattern of high teacher attrition in charter schools was evident regardless of district setting, although the difference in turnover rates across school types was greatest in urban setting and smallest in Michigan's rural districts. Charters had a stability rate of 63%, or a turnover rate of roughly 37%, compared to 80% stability, 20% turnover in urban districts. This means that more than 1/3 of urban charter school teachers move to another school or leave the profession each year. And as many of you know, the vast majority of Michigan's charters are located in our urban centers of the state. Michigan's high teacher turnover rates relative to the U.S. overall begs the question whether state-specific dynamics may be at work here. Some observers have wondered what role federal and state education policies, specifically those affecting the educator workforce, have played in changes in the teacher labor markets. Michigan has been no stranger to these reforms. Largely as part of its Race to the Top application for federal funding, Michigan enacted a sweeping and comprehensive suite of teacher labor reforms in 2011. The package of new laws reduced teacher tenure protections, implemented a new teacher evaluation system based on student outcomes, and made changes to collective bargaining. On top of these education reforms, the state adopted a right-to-work law in the fall of 2012, further curbing the financial resource base and political power of organized labor. Many opponents of the reforms have referred to the combination of policy changes as Michigan's war on teachers, arguing that they would drive current and prospective teachers from the profession and contribute to shortages. In 2017, researchers at Michigan State's Education Policy Innovation Collaborative examined these reforms in order to determine if they had any effect on teacher attrition and whether they contributed to the state's rise in turnover rates since the mid-2000s. The study confirmed that although rates varied for teachers with different years of experience, exit rates for each individual group had been relatively stable before the Michigan reforms were enacted in 2010. Following implementation of these reforms, the researchers found attrition rates increased substantially by about 1 percentage point per year. Is this evidence that the state's war on teachers caused higher exits from the profession? While there is certainly some correlation here, what about causality? Probably just best to quote the MSU study's conclusion, and I quote, "Although teachers have been exiting schools at higher rates, the teacher-specific reforms had no particular impact on exits apart from whatever forces were affecting employees in public schools more generally. Our results cast doubt on claims made by opponents of high-stakes teacher evaluation systems and other recent reforms that such reforms would lead to a mass exodus of teachers." While the MSU study focused on current teachers, other research looked into the effects of teacher accountability and tenure reforms on new or prospective teachers. This work found that states' adoption of these reforms were associated with the reduction in the number of teacher prep program enrollments and graduates. In other words, such reforms were shown to have a supply side effect. As we'll see shortly, Michigan's supply of new teachers from these programs has been plunging for some time. Further study would be required to see what role, if any, Michigan's war on teachers has contributed to the downward trend in teacher supply our state has been experiencing. I know we talked about the overall changes in enrollment and the decline there. I think it's important to dissect what's going on with certain student populations and how that might affect teacher demand. As I mentioned, teacher demand is influenced by enrollment and specifically by the characteristics of students attending public schools. I've already mentioned the overall decline. That overall decline, however, masks important enrollment changes in certain subgroups. Dissecting the overall enrollment by these high-need student populations reveals some stark compositional changes. Special education, economically disadvantaged students, and English language learners students often have additional educational needs and require supplemental resources. Specially trained teachers are required to provide educational services to special ed and ELL students, while disadvantaged students often require additional instructional supports to grow academically and succeed in the classroom. The state of Michigan allocates additional state resources to districts specifically for instructional programs, teachers and teacher aides targeting at-risk and ELL students. And of course, federal title money is directed to schools to assist these student populations with supports and additional instruction. Compared to the continuous decline in overall student enrollment, the number of students identified as economically disadvantaged and the number of non-English speaking students have gone in different direction. These student populations have increased in size and as a share of the total population, as we can see here in the chart. Given recent enrollment trends for ELL and disadvantaged students, demand is on the rise for instructors with experience in training and leading these classrooms. This despite the fact that the overall demand in Michigan is facing downward pressure. Shifting over to the supply side of the labor market, let's take a look at recent trends affecting the pipeline. The first place to start is entrance to the pipeline, enrollment in teacher prep programs. This chart shows data for both program enrollees across all of state's programs, traditional alternative, as well as program completers. As noted here, the total number of enrollees is down nearly 2/3 since 2009. And over a slightly shorter period, the number of program completers is down about 36%. In light of the long-standing downward trend in student enrollment, a decline in supply is not unexpected. We would expect that a well-functioning labor market in the face of falling demand would supply fewer teachers. However, the degree of decline in supply is fairly significant. So what accounts for this? Michigan's not alone. Nationally, enrollment in teacher prep is down about 23% over the same period. The decline in teacher prep follows a broader trend in Michigan post-secondary education enrollment over the same period, but to a much greater extent. Total enrollment in all 4-year and 2-year public-private post-secondary institutions in Michigan fell by about 8% over the same period, just a fraction of the decline seen in teacher prep. Raw number of graduates is down. This means fewer potential high school graduates available to fill college classrooms. Michigan is home to 37 training programs, and changes in these enrollment experiences has varied. Some have not been hit as hard as others. MSU, for example, saw a 6% decline in its teacher prep program from 2011 to 2016, while Western Michigan saw a 43% fall in graduates over the same period. The rising cost of college cannot be ignored in this discussion. Michigan has some of the highest student loan debt in the country. For the class of 2017, Michigan ranks 11th nationally with an average student debt load upon graduation of about $3,100. 58% of high school graduates owe money on student loans. This has to be a figure that goes into the financial calculation for potential future teachers as they consider career choices. According to an ACT report, the number of high school students interested in an education major dropped to its lowest level on record in 2015, as the percent of all ACT tested graduates planning to pursue education dropped 16% from 2011 to 2015. Another reason is likely the signaling and messaging from state policy actions and current public school workers. The recent teacher labor reforms may have had a chilling effect on recruitment efforts into teaching profession. Similarly, messaging delivered by current classroom teachers to their students that the profession is one of low prestige, low pay, low morale, and high stress may be being heard. High school graduates from today's public schools are the main supply source for tomorrow's teaching force. Maybe not intentionally, but this messaging may be dissuading some students from pursuing the profession. Another factor is Michigan's current economic climate. With an unemployment rate of 4%, down from a high of 14.4% during the depths of the Great Recession, high school students are looking at a very tight labor market and finding greener pastures in other fields, whether in the private or public sector. In Michigan, are teacher prep programs producing the teachers that schools need, or is there a mismatch? One way to think about this question is to look at production relative to broad shortage areas identified by schools. These would be STEM, special ed, early childhood, and English language learners. The chart on the right shows endorsement activity by areas commonly identified as shortages. Endorsements are credentials required to allow teachers to teach in specific subjects, primarily used at the secondary level. Certified teachers can hold more than one endorsement, allowing them to teach in different subjects. High school teachers generally require area-specific endorsements, while many elementary teachers receive a general endorsement for that grade setting. Not shown here is what is happening with initial certification activity by grade level. For the elementary grade level, the number of certificates are down about 36%. This compares to an overall, briefly, overall, the number of initial certificates are down 33% between 2012 and 2016. Michigan issued roughly 5,500 initial certificates in 2012 compared to 3,700 in 2016. However, elementary level certificates are down 30%, while high school certificate production is down 38%. In raw numbers, Michigan, like other states, has long produced more elementary teachers than high school teachers, largely because of the large share of students in these lower grades. However, the disparate rates between the grade levels here suggests that Michigan is growing the share of teachers trained to enter the elementary classroom. This is a trend worth noting. We don't know if these are the jobs in the highest demand, as most schools faced with staffing challenges highlight the need to fill school positions. Back to the data in the table. A couple observations. Within STEM, that shows a 39% reduction in endorsement activity. Biology endorsements are down 45%, chemistry are down 64%, physics 54%. General science, on the other hand, and math are down 34% and 37%. So clearly there's some more than meets the eye within this endorsement activity. Early childhood shows a much larger decline overall, but keep in mind that we know there's been a strong push by the state to increase state-funded preschool for eligible 4-year-olds through the Great Start Readiness Program. So the 48% is running up against a trend in higher demand for teachers because of the demand or because of the availability of 4-year-old preschool spots in public school classrooms. As a state, Michigan continues to grapple with many public education issues. The state's ranking relative to other states on national student assessments continues to fall. Achievement gaps across various student groups are persistent and growing, and school financing remains a juggernaut that policymakers grapple with. We should add to this list the challenges schools are finding to adequately staff all their classrooms. Unfortunately, to date, Michigan has not invested much time or financial resources to study teacher shortages. Clear-cut data depicting a teacher shortage in Michigan is hard to come by. So what we are left with are some broad indicators, some of which I want to cover in the next couple slides. Let me start with the use of non-certified teachers, substitutes. Michigan law requires public schools to staff classrooms with certified and endorsed teachers. To address needed exceptions, state law allows the use of substitute teachers when a fully credentialed teacher is not available. When schools have difficult time finding full-time teachers, either because of a general or localized shortage, the demand for substitute personnel increases. Heightened use here can be a broad indicator of shortage. In recent years, Michigan school districts have increased their reliance on substitute teachers to staff general education classrooms. The number of substitute permits requested increased 19% between 2013 and 2018. Over 25,000 substitute permits were issued in 2018. The most common of these, the daily permit, increased 14% over the 5-year period, from about 21,000 permits to 25,000 permits. Recognizing the decreased demand schools have for substitute, or the increased demand schools have for substitute teachers, the Michigan Department of Ed is offering new permit types to meet schools' varying needs. Despite the recent changes to substitute permits, I should note here that there is also mounting evidence that schools are finding it difficult to staff classrooms with substitutes. With increasing demand and shrinking supply, the substitute teacher shortage adds another dimension to the labor market imbalance facing schools. Another widely used indicator is the experiences that districts have filling specific vacancies. Michigan schools are required to annually report to the Department of Ed those classrooms where they are having difficulty finding teachers. The data for this report is aggregated at the state level and not available at the public or district or regional level. Therefore, it's limited in its usefulness. We don't know where schools are reporting shortages are located and what their student bodies look like. Despite these details, lacking these details, looking at the federal designated shortage area report provides some insights as to patterns and trends. Looking at this report over the most recent 5-year period shows shortages in career tech, special ed, bilingual, and ESL fields. Also, math and science teachers show up on this listing. This is consistent with the experience across other states. States show considerable variation in the reporting of shortage areas with the overall condition of the state's teacher force and the specific challenges related to different conditions affecting teacher labor markets, such as teacher compensation, working conditions, and teacher turnover. The bottom line here, Michigan is not alone. It's clear from the trends in teacher prep enrollment and completions covered earlier, as well as the endorsement activity, that teacher supply is shrinking rather significantly. What is not so clear is whether at current levels there's ample new supply to meet teacher demand arising from school hiring needs. Unfortunately, Michigan doesn't compile the statewide data on an annual school district hiring activity. Also, the information it does collect that might be used for this purpose is not readily available. The lack of consistent and regularly updated school personnel hiring information is another impediment in assessing the true teacher shortage picture. A recent Department of Ed policy brief sheds light on hiring trends. This snapshot report examines the number of individuals gaining teaching employment in Michigan for the first time in each year, 2012 through 2017. The information was reported on a statewide basis and didn't get into the district level specifics. The data provides another broad look into the current status of teacher labor market, whether there is evidence of either an over and under supply of teachers in Michigan. The data is presented in the chart on the right of the screen here. The high-level takeaways here are that new certificates have dropped substantially, hiring has also declined but not as much, and that there's a clear convergence between these two trends. I wanted to dig in just real briefly into 3 other shortage areas that have been highlighted both in the federal reporting on shortage areas as well as what we've seen in endorsement activity. And what I've provided here is a look at changes in student populations over a 5-year period as well as endorsement activity. In this chart, students are the solid line and endorsement activities represented by the dashed line. For ELL students that have grown considerably, 79% over this period, the number of endorsements, ELL endorsements, has shrunk by 13%. So clearly, the demand that's being created by rising enrollments in this student population aren't being met necessarily by the endorsement activity. And then if we look at special ed students, Their numbers have dropped more or less in line with the overall student population in the state, but endorsement activity in special ed has declined by over a third. So even though there's a decline there in the demand, the supply as measured by endorsement is down by a much greater degree. And then if we look at early childhood students, those numbers are up almost 80% over this 5-year period, but endorsement activity is down 50% from 2012 to 2017. So again, a closer look at what's going on in these 3 shortage areas. So a number of factors have contributed to workforce challenges facing public schools. Similarly, possible solutions to the issue must be multifaceted. Simply stated, there are no silver bullets. Our report covers a number of promising strategies to address teacher labor market imbalances without undermining teacher quality or teacher certification requirements. To get serious about tackling this issue, stakeholders should begin with a focus on Michigan's high teacher turnover. In the face of declining teacher supply, stakeholders can address the shortage challenge by reducing the demand for new teachers. Just to recap, our research shows that turnover rates in Michigan are higher than the national average and have worsened over time. This is particularly problematic in the state's urban schools and charter schools, and in those schools with the high concentrations of poverty. Developing effective retention strategies requires a thoughtful, context-specific, and comprehensive approach. Research has shown that successful strategies focus on compensation, teacher prep, support, and professional development, along with school leadership and organizational considerations. First, compensation. Michigan does not have a statewide teacher schedule like many states. Therefore, pay and compensation structures are determined locally. Generally, retention is aided when compensation packages are competitive with those other occupations requiring the same educational background, training, and experience. This ensures that education sector can compete in the labor market for well-qualified teachers. Examining compensation across any occupation could be fraught with claims and counterclaims, and public teacher salaries debate is no different. At the average, Michigan compensates its teachers fairly well compared to schools across the country, at about 10% higher than the U.S. average. However, when it comes to salaries for those entering the workforce, Michigan's average starting salary is 3.3 percentage points below the U.S. average. While money may not be the most important factor for an individual choosing a career in education, it is a common reason given when teachers exit. Developing ways to increase starting salaries may go ways towards encouraging individuals to enter the profession and retain current teachers. Successful strategies in this regard include differential pay for hard-to-staff classrooms and positions. This would require schools to break from the traditional pay model based largely on service time and educational background. Another intervention schools might consider adopting is the use of incentive-based funding to reward successful classroom teaching, sending the message that moving the academic needle will come with financial rewards. With respect to preparation and support, teacher residencies should be considered. They are modeled after the primary training program used in the medical field for over 100 years. Schools recruit candidates to work in a classroom as paid apprentices and are partnered with skilled, expert teachers for up to a full year while they complete their coursework. Residents receive financial support in exchange for a commitment to remain in the classroom for a period of time after their formal training. 3 to 5 years is common. The model requires a strong partnership between a teacher preparation program, usually a university, and the local district to ensure that training is tailored to the unique educational needs of the district's students and the specific hiring needs of the district. This might be for a specific classroom, student population. Research into these programs shows success at retaining teachers. Teachers are the frontline educators leading classrooms, but they're also part of a team within a school. A growing body of research points to the importance of principals and school culture in fostering student achievement. High levels of staff churn disrupts culture and inhibits the development of key social relationships between teachers and students, teachers and staff, and teachers in their communities. Improving teacher retention can help maintain a healthy organizational climate, which in turn helps student achievement. School leadership also matters. Attributes and definitions of quality leader may vary, but evidence suggests 2 components of school leadership that are integral in the retention puzzle: administrative support and leadership style. Weak principal leadership is identified as an important variable in teacher turnover in schools dealing with already high turnover rates, such as high poverty, low achieving schools, placing further emphasis on improving leadership in those settings. And with that, that's the end of my formal slide presentation, and we do have some time for questions. I've got a question here that's kind of off topic, asking when will the new superintendent take office? And I guess I just don't have a answer to that one, so we're going to punt on that one. And as I scroll through here, I don't see any other questions.
All right, that concludes today's presentation. If you have any other questions about today's material that we did not get to, feel free to send us an email with that question. Finally, just a reminder that you will receive an email soliciting feedback on today's webinar. We look forward to your comments.
I want to add one more thing, that the webinar will be posted on our website along with the slide deck and available to share later this afternoon. So please look for it there. Again, thank you for your time and interest in the CRC.